Mud and steel. Eastern Front echoes. Late 1944, the sky hung low. A cold, colorless sheet over the rolling mud fields of eastern France. Rain had fallen for days, turning every road into a slick brown trench. A convoy of American Shermans crept forward, engines growling, treads biting deep into the muck. Their olive-drab hulls were plastered with mud, their white stars half hidden beneath grime. On a ridge above, two German officers watched through binoculars. Their gray coats were spotless. Their panzers, sleek, formidable machines, stood idle behind them, their wide tracks sunk halfway into the sodden earth. One officer smirked as a Sherman slipped sideways on the slope. "Amerikanische Spielzeuge," he muttered. "American toys." But the toys didn't stop. The Shermans churned on, one after another, crawling through the mire like stubborn beasts. While German engines coughed and failed, the Americans advanced. Slow, steady, unstoppable. That day, laughter faded beneath the rain, because the world was beginning to learn that endurance, not elegance, would win this war. The age of the Panzer. Before the laughter, before the mud and the breakdowns, there was triumph. In 1939, when German armor first rolled across Poland, the world witnessed a new kind of warfare. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, became the word whispered in every foreign command room. Fast, coordinated, mechanized. Germany's panzers didn't just fight. They moved. They pierced front lines, encircled divisions, and shattered armies before they could retreat. To the Wehrmacht, tanks weren't merely machines. They were instruments of dominance, extensions of national pride, the birth of confidence. By 1940, the victories were absolute. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, all overwhelmed by columns of gray-painted armor moving with impossible precision. The world saw black crosses flashing across fields, always advancing, never stalling. At the heart of this momentum were tanks like the Panzer III and Panzer IV, not invincible, but advanced for their time. They combined maneuverability, communications, and leadership in a way no other army had mastered. German tank crews were professionals, trained, disciplined, and steeped in technical mastery. Each commander was expected to understand not only tactics, but the inner workings of his machine. In every company, there was pride. In engineering, in precision, in control. Engineering as ideology, Germany's industrial genius ran deep. Every bolt, every gear reflected a culture that prized craftsmanship and complexity. To German designers, tanks were not just tools, they were statements. The Panzer IV, and later the Panther and Tiger, embodied this perfectionism. They were heavier, stronger, and technologically superior to nearly anything the Allies fielded in the early years. But this pursuit of perfection carried a hidden flaw. It demanded time, materials, and precision that war would soon deny. In the German mind, however, superiority was self-evident. They built machines to be the best, and those who did otherwise were viewed as crude imitators. A doctrine of shock and awe in 1941. As Operation Barbarossa roared eastward into the Soviet Union, this doctrine reached its peak. Over 3,000 German tanks stormed the vast plains, slicing through Red Army formations. The sheer speed and coordination stunned the world again. For the men inside those steel beasts, the tank was almost sacred. A weapon of destiny. The sight of Soviet T-26s burning along endless roads confirmed their belief in German engineering supremacy. When the first T-34 appeared, its sloped armor and wide tracks shocked the Wehrmacht. For a moment, the myth cracked, but only briefly. German engineers immediately sought to outmatch it, designing the Panther, the Tiger, and later the monstrous King Tiger. Each iteration grew heavier, more complex, more refined. They were marvels of metallurgy and nightmares to produce, maintain, and repair. Pride and overreach by 1943, the German tank industry was stretched thin. Skilled laborers were conscripted. Factories were bombed. Yet the demand for perfection never eased. Commanders wanted better optics, thicker armor, higher velocity guns. Hitler himself personally intervened in design decisions, demanding the best tank in the world. They built them, but at a cost. The Tiger could crush any Allied tank in one-on-one combat, but it broke down after a few dozen miles. The Panther was devastating when it worked, but its transmission was fragile, its logistics nightmarish. What Germany gained in power, it lost in reliability. What it built in brilliance, it sacrificed in numbers. And while the Germans obsessed over precision, the Americans were learning a different lesson. One born not in laboratories, but on factory floors. The arsenal of democracy across the Atlantic. Far from the thunder of blitzkrieg, another kind of war machine was awakening. In 1940, America was still a nation at peace. Industrial, confident, but untested. Its army ranked 17th in the world, behind Portugal. Its tanks were outdated, its officers skeptical of mechanized warfare. Yet, as Europe burned, the U.S. began preparing, not for brilliance, but for scale. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared America would become the arsenal of democracy, he wasn't just speaking of weapons. He was speaking of a transformation, of factories, railways, and men. Detroit would become a battlefield without bombs. The birth of the M4, the U.S. Army needed a tank that could be mass-produced, shipped across oceans, and repaired in the field by ordinary mechanics. It had to be light enough for transport, fast enough for infantry support, and simple enough for soldiers to learn in days. The result was the M4 Sherman, a tank that looked ordinary, almost unimpressive. With a 75mm gun, medium armor, and a gasoline engine, it lacked the intimidating silhouette of the Panther or Tiger. To German eyes, it looked like a child's imitation. High profile, thinly armored, and mechanically crude. But underneath that unremarkable shell was something Germany could never match: reliability. Every component of the Sherman could be interchanged, repaired or replaced in the field. Its engine ran in heat, mud, or snow. Its tracks stayed intact for hundreds of miles. When one broke down, parts were already waiting, shipped through an industrial network that spanned continents. The Sherman wasn't built for duels. It was built to keep moving. Simplicity as strategy in American doctrine, tanks weren't dueling knights. They were moving fortresses, advancing with infantry and artillery in combined arms formations. The U.S. believed in mobility and logistics over single-vehicle supremacy. Each tank was part of a system, and that system was colossal. By 1942, American factories were producing thousands of tanks a month. The Detroit tank arsenal, managed by Chrysler, became the beating heart of armored mass production. Assembly lines that once built cars now churned out Shermans with ruthless efficiency. Steelworkers, many of them women, worked under blinding lights, welding hulls through the night. Within hours, a new machine rolled off the line, ready for shipment to Africa, Europe, or the Pacific. While Germany built masterpieces, America built an army. First blood in Africa. When the Sherman first appeared in combat during the North African Campaign in late 1942, its reputation was uncertain. Against early panzers, it performed well, its mobility and firepower proving adequate. Crews praised its reliability, commanders its range. But by 1943, as Germany fielded heavier tanks in Tunisia, the Sherman began to look outclassed. Its guns struggled to penetrate the armor of a Tiger, and its high profile made it an easy target. German tankers scoffed. To them, the Sherman was an inferior imitation. Fast, yes, but fragile. They joked that one Tiger was worth 5 Shermans. What they didn't realize was that the Americans could send 6. The laughter came easily in those early days. German crews prided themselves on marksmanship and engineering. They saw themselves as professionals facing amateurs. But war, as history would soon remind them, is not fought on pride alone. Numbers and endurance. By mid-1944, more than 50,000 Shermans had been built, a number no other nation could rival. Spare parts flooded supply lines, mechanics trained en masse. And when the Allies landed in Normandy, those toys rolled down every hedgerow and across every field. For every destroyed Sherman, another took its place within hours. Crews switched tanks like soldiers changing rifles. German aces destroyed dozens, yet were overwhelmed by hundreds more. The Allies had mastered not the art of the perfect machine, but the science of relentless replacement. And that, quietly, began to terrify the German command, because as the mud thickened and supply lines thinned, those laughable American machines kept moving, while many of Germany's finest weapons died where they stood. The machine that wasn't meant to impress. The M4 Sherman was never meant to dazzle. It was meant to deliver. Where the Germans built machines like artisans crafting a masterpiece, the Americans built theirs like engineers solving a problem. Every rivet, every weld was a compromise between performance, logistics, and production. And yet, in those compromises lay its genius. The technological angle. Simplicity over sophistication. The Sherman's greatest advantage wasn't its gun, its armor, or its speed. It was its dependability. Its engine could run on ordinary fuel. Its suspension was easy to maintain. The transmission, though crude compared to German precision, could be replaced in the field without a factory. Even the turret ring, often damaged in combat, could be swapped by crews using simple cranes. The Sherman used standardized parts across multiple factories. That meant a replacement bolt from a tank built in Detroit fit perfectly into one built in California. For an army operating across continents, that consistency was revolutionary. The Germans had no such luxury. Each Tiger was hand-built, almost bespoke. Spare parts had to be custom machined, and recovery vehicles struggled to tow their immense weight. A single mechanical failure could immobilize a million-mark machine. The Sherman's genius was invisible. It was the machine that worked when others didn't, too. The tactical angle, speed, and coordination in the field. The Sherman's reliability transformed tactics. German tanks often advanced like lone predators, powerful but isolated. The Sherman, by contrast, was part of a pack. Its radio system was excellent, allowing real-time coordination between tank units, infantry, and air support. A platoon of Shermans could maneuver as one, flank faster, and retreat efficiently. In Normandy, this coordination was critical. When one tank was hit, others didn't retreat in confusion. They shifted position, called for artillery, or summoned a P-47 Thunderbolt overhead. It wasn't the strength of the tank that mattered, but the strength of the system behind it. While a Tiger could destroy a Sherman from 1,500 meters, a squadron of Shermans could encircle it within minutes. The Americans learned to use mobility as a weapon, movement instead of armor. The Sherman's lightweight also made it ideal for amphibious operations and bridging, vital in a war of rivers and coasts. When Germany's heavy armor bogged down, the Shermans kept rolling, climbing, and crossing. The industrial angle. Mass as a weapon in war, quantity becomes a kind of quality. By 1944, the U.S. was producing more tanks in a month than Germany could in half a year. The sheer rhythm of American industry overwhelmed the Axis supply chain. This wasn't just a matter of numbers. It was a new kind of warfare, industrialized attrition. For every Tiger lost, Germany mourned the loss of a masterpiece. For every Sherman lost, America replaced it before dawn. Factories like Fisher Body, Pressed Steel Car Company, and Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal worked around the clock. Conveyor belts replaced workshops. Blue-collar workers became part of the war effort's front line, their torches and hammers as crucial as rifles and grenades. This system of production blurred the line between civilian and soldier. While German commanders spoke of valor and discipline, American generals spoke of supply and maintenance. In the words of General Omar Bradley, amateurs talk strategy. Professionals talk logistics. It was logistics, not glamour, that won the fields of Europe. The cultural angle, pride versus pragmatism for Germany. The tank was an expression of national identity, strong, precise, intimidating. For America, it was a tool, functional, practical, and replaceable. This difference in mindset shaped every decision. The Germans sought excellence. The Americans sought effectiveness. Even the design aesthetics reflected that contrast. German tanks were angular, imposing, meticulously finished. Shermans were boxy, almost clumsy, painted in flat olive, with welded seams that looked rushed. But where the Germans saw art, the Americans saw efficiency. When a Tiger broke down, it became a stranded monument. When a Sherman broke down, it was repaired, replaced, or cannibalized within hours. War doesn't reward pride, it rewards persistence. And as 1944 unfolded, persistence began to crush perfection. Men inside the steel. War is fought by machines, but it's endured by men. Inside every Sherman, 5 soldiers shared a space barely large enough for 3. The air reeked of fuel, oil, and sweat. The roar of the Continental engine drowned every thought. Heat in the summer could scorch their boots. In winter, cold bit through steel. And yet, they fought, not because their tank was superior, but because it worked when they needed it to. The human angle, courage in a thin-shelled German tank. Crews often looked down on the Sherman's thin armor, calling it a Ronson after the lighter brand because it lights every time. And they were right. When hit by an 88mm gun, the Sherman burned fast. Crews knew this. They watched comrades vanish in flames and still climbed into the same machine the next morning. They called it the coffin for 5 brothers. But they also knew it would start, it would move, and it would get them home if they could drive fast enough. American crews learned to compensate through teamwork. They flanked, moved, and called for air support with discipline. They didn't duel tigers. They hunted them in packs. In letters home, many wrote not about fear, but frustration. Frustration that the enemy's tanks looked unbeatable. But slowly, through mud and fire, they learned something deeper. Survival was victory, and endurance was power. The leadership angle. Commanders who understood. Reality American generals didn't design strategy around duels. They designed around logistics. General George S. Patton, himself an armored warfare pioneer, saw tanks as cavalry reborn, fast, aggressive, always moving. He famously said, "A good plan, violently executed now, is better than a perfect plan next week." The Sherman fit that philosophy perfectly. It could move faster than any German heavy tank, cover more ground, and keep the advance alive. Commanders like Omar Bradley, Dwight Eisenhower, and Leslie McNair understood that this wasn't a contest of hardware. It was a contest of endurance. They built strategies that valued constant momentum, even at high cost. Behind every advance was a supply convoy, repair teams, engineers, and replacement tanks rolling from the docks to the front. The Sherman didn't win battles by being the strongest tank. It won by being there when needed. Even in chaos, the system held. A tank destroyed in Normandy could be replaced within 48 hours. No other army on Earth could match that rhythm. The enemy perception angle, laughter, fades to the Germans. The first Shermans they encountered seemed laughable. Wehrmacht intelligence reports described them as lightly armored, numerous, but tactically inferior. Tank aces like Michael Wittmann, who destroyed entire Allied columns with his Tiger, saw them as prey. Early footage shows German crews joking as captured Shermans were paraded through occupied towns. But by 1944, the laughter had faded. At Falaise, Saint-Lô, and later the Bulge, German soldiers began to witness something they had never faced before: an enemy that simply didn't stop coming. No matter how many tanks they burned, more appeared. No matter how many bridges they blew, more Shermans crossed. And when German fuel ran dry, the Americans kept rolling. Captured officers admitted astonishment at the speed with which Allied units replaced their armor. One remarked bitterly, "The Americans fight a machine war. We fight with our souls, and it is not enough." The myth of German invincibility was eroding, not under superior firepower, but under superior persistence. The moral angle, the weight of war, for the men on both sides, tanks were both shield and tomb. The Sherman crew knew they were outgunned. The Panzer crew knew they were outnumbered. Both fought with desperation. But as the months wore on, a strange respect grew in the German ranks. They began to realize that the Allies' inferior machines were not weak. They were relentless. To face one, Sherman was trivial. To face 100, supported by artillery, air power, and endless replacements, that broke morale. War had shifted from valor to volume, from duels to endurance. And the men inside those Shermans, farmers, mechanics, students, became part of a machine far larger than themselves. They weren't fighting for glory. They were pushing history forward. The fields of Normandy, June 6, 1944, dawn. The beaches of Normandy burned under smoke and steel. Thousands of landing craft cut through the surf, delivering men, supplies, and machines to the coast of France. Among them, the M4 Sherman. The first tanks to roll ashore were drowned by waves, buried in sand, or torn apart by mines. But many made it through. Their engines coughed, their tracks clawed at the beachhead, and their crews fought not just the enemy, but the terrain itself. German officers had expected the Allies to falter. They believed no tank could maneuver through the hedgerows, no logistics could sustain the landing, no mechanic could fix what the surf destroyed. But by nightfall, the first Shermans were already pushing inland, battered, muddy, but moving. Hedgerow Hell Normandy wasn't a battlefield. It was a maze. Thick earthen walls divided every field, each one a natural fortress. German defenders, armed with Panzerfausts and 80 mm guns, turned every corner into an ambush. Sherman crews adapted fast. Using welded steel teeth called rhino cutters, they tore through the hedges instead of climbing them. They learned to coordinate with infantry and artillery, turning chaos into method. A single Tiger could destroy a Sherman from half a mile away. But while it was repositioning, 3 more Shermans were flanking its sides. In one infamous encounter near Villers-Bocage, German ace Michael Wittmann ambushed a British column, destroying dozens of Shermans in minutes. For the Germans, it was proof of superiority. But in the weeks that followed, Wittmann's Tiger was hunted, encircled, and destroyed by a squadron of those same inferior tanks. The message was clear. In this war, even legends could be buried beneath numbers. The industrial front on French soil behind every tank that fought in Normandy, a factory in America, was already building its replacement. When a Sherman was lost, a coded message traveled up the logistics chain. Within days, a fresh tank rolled off a ship at Cherbourg or Omaha, ready for deployment. Crews rotated, trained, and remounted. This conveyor belt of war defied German comprehension. The Wehrmacht's armored divisions, once unstoppable, now fought on starvation. Their factories were bombed, their trains ambushed, their fuel gone. In July 1944, Hitler demanded a counterattack, Operation Lüttich, to drive the Allies back into the sea. German armor surged toward Mortain, but they met not a fragile front, but a storm of coordination. Shermans called in artillery barrages, P-47s screamed overhead, and within 48 hours, the attack was shattered. The once proud panzer divisions were bleeding out, not in grand duels, but in endless attrition. The Falaise Trap August, 1944. The German 7th Army was retreating east, its columns choked with refugees, broken armor, and desperation. The Allies saw their chance to close the pocket at Falaise. It was here that the Sherman showed its ultimate power, momentum. Through cratered roads and collapsing bridges, through smoke and fire, Sherman divisions kept moving. Faster than command could issue orders. The roads turned into rivers of steel. German tanks tried to hold the line. Tigers, Panthers, Jagdpanzer IVOs, their guns exacting a brutal toll. But for every one destroyed, 10 more Shermans advanced. By mid-August, the trap snapped shut. Thousands of German vehicles lay wrecked. Columns burned under Allied fire. Even the Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was powerless against the sheer scale of Allied might. A German survivor later wrote, "We fired until the barrels glowed. Still, they came. Endless tanks, endless planes, endless men." The laughter that once echoed across occupied Europe had turned to silence. The psychological shift, the myth of German invincibility was gone. Reports from the front began to reach. Berlin, reports that spoke not of victory, but of exhaustion. The Tiger was too heavy for retreat. The Panther, too complex for field repair. Crews were abandoning their tanks, sabotaging engines to prevent capture. Meanwhile, Sherman crews, young, often inexperienced, grew more confident with each mile. They had seen what their machines could endure. They trusted them. For the first time, German soldiers began referring to the Sherman with reluctant respect. Not as a toy, but as a symbol of Allied persistence. It wasn't fast, it wasn't elegant, but it never stopped moving. The winter that broke the Reich, December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay silent under a blanket of snow. Then, before dawn, the silence shattered. Artillery thundered. Trees exploded into splinters. Thousands of German guns roared at once. The opening barrage of Operation Wacht am Rhine, Hitler's last gamble. From the forests rolled the steel monsters of the Panzerwaffe. Tiger IIs, Panthers, Jagdpanthers, and King Tigers emerging like ghosts through the fog. Their mission: split the Allied front, seize Antwerp, and crush the Western armies in one blow. Caught off guard, the American lines reeled. Entire units were engulfed. Villages burned. The snow turned black with smoke and diesel. Among the chaos, the Shermans faced their greatest trial. The shock of the counterattack German armor surged forward with terrifying precision. At Bastogne, St. Vith, and Malmedy, Allied forces were surrounded or forced back. To many, it looked like 1940 all over again. The return of Blitzkrieg. German commanders once again laughed at the sight of Shermans struggling in the snow, their engines sputtering in the cold. But the laughter didn't last. The German offensive depended on fuel, and the Shermans had something the Tigers did not: logistics. As German tanks advanced, they ran dry. Frozen roads slowed them. Their heavy weight shattered bridges. Meanwhile, American supply convoys, driven through blizzards, strafed by fighters, kept the Shermans fed and fighting. For every panzer that froze in the forest, a Sherman arrived from behind. Bastogne. Holding the line at the heart of the Ardennes stood Bastogne, encircled and battered. The 101st Airborne held the town, but it was the Shermans that kept the lifelines open. Through waist-deep snow, columns of tanks from Patton's Third Army roared north, engines straining, treads clanking through ice and mud. Patton's men advanced 100 miles in freezing weather, an impossible maneuver by any standard. His armored divisions reached Bastogne on December 26th, breaking the siege. When they arrived, the Shermans were caked in frost, their crews half frozen, but the engines were still running. One German prisoner, stunned at the sight, muttered, "Our Tigers die in the cold. Yours don't." The Tiger's tomb, the King Tiger, was an engineering marvel. Its 80mm gun could pierce any Allied tank from over a mile away. Its armor was nearly impregnable, but in the Ardennes it became its own enemy. Weighing 70 tons, it guzzled fuel faster than it could be supplied. Many broke down before reaching the front. Crews were forced to abandon them, destroying the machines they had once worshipped. The Sherman, lighter and simpler, moved through frozen rivers and narrow mountain passes. Its tracks held firm where the Tigers sank. Again and again, Shermans flanked the immobilized giants, calling in artillery or airstrikes to finish the job. This was no longer a war of superior weapons. It was a war of endurance. The air clears by late December. The skies finally opened. Allied fighter-bombers screamed over the forest, turning the battlefield into a furnace. Columns of German armor were annihilated from above. Sherman crews, emboldened, advanced with air support overhead. The snow melted into mud, but the tanks didn't stop. They crossed burned-out villages, shattered columns, and the frozen wrecks of panzers that had once terrorized Europe. By January 1945, the German offensive was dead. The panzer divisions were spent, their finest machines lost not to enemy fire, but to exhaustion and starvation. The drive to the Rhine. After the Bulge, the Allied advance became relentless. The Shermans led the charge into Germany itself. Across the Siegfried Line, they crushed concrete bunkers and crossed rivers under constant shell fire. In one day, engineers threw up pontoon bridges across the Rhine, and within hours, the Shermans were rolling over them. German defenses collapsed not with a final explosion, but with a slow mechanical failure, the sound of engines dying. One by one, in towns like Remagen and Cologne, German soldiers surrendered at the sight of endless columns of tanks. For every panzer that fired, 50 Shermans answered. By spring, the American columns were advancing faster than maps could track them. From the Ardennes to the Ruhr, from forest to factory, the Shermans' tracks carved a single word into the soil of Europe: inevitability. The end of the road in April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin. Many German crews set fire to their own tanks rather than surrender them. Their last great machines, those perfect symbols of German engineering, lay smoldering in the mud. The Sherman, meanwhile, was still moving, its final missions escorting convoys, freeing prisoners, and clearing the ruins of towns that had once been fortresses. One German mechanic, captured near Kassel, summed it up quietly: "We built for victory. You built for survival. Survival won." The reckoning of steel. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a graveyard of machines. Across the fields of France, Belgium, and Germany lay thousands of burned-out hulks, twisted metal, rusting armor, the skeletons of a mechanical age. Tanks that once symbolized might now stood as monuments to exhaustion. Among them were the ruins of the Wehrmacht's pride. Panthers, tigers, and jagdpanthers, magnificent in their design, tragic in their end. Many had not been destroyed by enemy fire, but by their own crews, abandoned when fuel ran out or engines failed, and scattered among them, still rumbling through the ruins of conquered cities, were Shermans, the numbers that broke the Reich by the war's end. The United States had produced over 49,000 M4 Shermans, more than all the tanks Germany built during the entire conflict. Of these, roughly 17,000 were lost in combat, an enormous number, but one America could absorb. Every Sherman destroyed had a successor already en route. Germany, by contrast, built fewer than 1,400 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers. Even when they outgunned and out-armored the Sherman, they could never outlast it. The war had proven an industrial truth. Mass production was might. Each Tiger required 10 times the man-hours to build as a Sherman. Every replacement part for a Panther had to be custom machined. When Allied bombers leveled factories like Kassel and Nuremberg, German armor output plummeted. In America, however, the assembly lines never stopped. Women welders, African-American laborers, and small-town machinists all became cogs in the arsenal of democracy. They didn't fight on the front, but their work decided who would win there. The human cost, but the statistics tell only part of the story. Behind each Sherman number plate were 5 men, often in their early 20s. Thousands never made it home. Many died inside those same machines that saved so many others. Crews wrote names on their tanks: Battling Bitch, Memphis Belle Tuikun, Fury, tokens of defiance and luck. They slept beside their machines, repaired them under shell fire, and carried with them a paradoxical affection for something that could kill them in an instant. Survivors would later recall not the glory, but the noise, the grinding gears, the screams over the intercom, the sound of shells ricocheting off armor. The Sherman had been their coffin and their savior. The German collapse for the Germans. The end came not with a bang, but with mechanical silence. Their panzers, once the spearhead of blitzkrieg, were now static fortresses, trapped by fuel shortages and overwhelmed by Allied mobility. Many divisions reached the front with fewer than 20 operational tanks. The Wehrmacht's faith in engineering perfection had turned into its downfall. Each Tiger destroyed was irreplaceable. Each Panther abandoned was a loss of both material and morale. By spring 1945, some German commanders ordered their tanks buried as stationary bunkers, a final, desperate attempt to slow the tide. The war that had begun with speed ended with stagnation. The symbol of victory, when Allied parades rolled through liberated Europe, it wasn't the Tiger or the Panther leading the columns. It was the Sherman. Children waved at its crews, soldiers leaned out from its hatches, flags draped across its hulls. For millions, the sight of those olive-green tanks meant liberation, the end of occupation, the return of freedom. To historians, the Sherman would come to represent a larger idea, that wars are not won by the most advanced weapons, but by the weapons that work the longest. Its simplicity had defeated complexity. Its reliability had outlasted genius. Lessons in iron and humility. When peace returned, the world began to count. Tanks, factories, and lives. And in that accounting came the uncomfortable truth. Germany had built the finest tanks of the war, and had still lost it. The German reflection, the cost of perfection. Post-war German officers were candid in their reports. They praised the craftsmanship of the Tiger and Panther, but admitted the flaw that pride had hidden. These machines had been too complex for total war. General Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, summarized it bitterly. "We had the best tanks, and the fewest." He had warned that Germany needed quantity, not just quality, but the warning came too late. By the time the Tiger prowled onto the battlefield, Germany was already bleeding resources it could never replenish. Even when the Tiger scored a dozen kills, it changed nothing. War had become a mathematics of replacement, and Germany could not solve that equation. The American reflection, the triumph of logistics across the Atlantic. American commanders studied the campaign with equal honesty. They knew the Sherman had flaws, its armor thin, its gun underpowered, its silhouette too high. But they also knew something more profound. It had done its job. The Sherman wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It reached the fight, it stayed in the fight, and it could be repaired in the field. Its operational readiness often exceeded 80%, while German tanks frequently fell below 40%. This reliability allowed Allied forces to maintain the initiative, to advance day after day. Regardless of weather or terrain, military historian Stephen Zaloga would later write, "The Sherman's strength was not in the duel, but in the campaign. And that was the essence of modern warfare, sustaining pressure until the enemy breaks." Redefining the future of armored war, the lessons of the Sherman shaped the design of every post-war tank. Speed, maintenance, and mass production became the new holy trinity of armored design. The British Centurion, the Soviet T-54, and the American Patton series all inherited the Sherman's philosophy. Mobility over perfection, reliability over brilliance. Even the Soviets, whose T-34 had mirrored the Sherman's simplicity, understood that the future belonged not to the best tank, but to the most sustainable one. The German obsession with engineering supremacy faded into history, admired but no longer emulated. The moral reckoning beneath the technical analysis lay something more human, a quiet reckoning with arrogance. The laughter that had once followed the sight of a Sherman in the mud had long since died. The war had proven that pride, when untempered by practicality, becomes self-destruction. The Panzer, magnificent as it was, had become a monument to overconfidence. The Sherman, humble and flawed, became a symbol of endurance, a machine that reflected the spirit of the soldiers who drove it. American tankers learned to fight without illusion, to trust not in superiority but in cooperation. German veterans, many of them brilliant tacticians, later admitted a grudging respect for the tank they once mocked. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Legacy of the toy. Decades later, in museums across Europe, the Sherman still stands beside the Tiger. Smaller, simpler, unassuming. Yet, the placards beneath tell a different story. The Tiger impressed. The Sherman endured. In that endurance lay victory. Engineers studying those machines today see the same truth that eluded so many in 1944, that reliability is a form of strength and flexibility a form of power. War, in the end, is not an art gallery of beautiful machines. It's a test of what survives the longest under fire. And the Sherman survived everything. Endurance over elegance. The war ended not with glory, but with silence. The clatter of tank treads faded into the rust of time. In their place came the lessons, quiet, unyielding, undeniable. History would remember the Tiger and the Panther as icons of engineering genius, beautiful in form, terrifying in function. But they were monuments to a lost idea, that brilliance alone could conquer. The Sherman was never beautiful. It was not feared nor admired. It was ordinary, and that was its triumph. It didn't seek perfection, it sought persistence. Its armor bent, its guns sometimes failed, but its heart, the machinery of movement, repair, and endurance, never stopped. In its simplicity lived a philosophy that survival itself is strength. Wars are often decided not by the sharpest sword, but by the weapon that can be lifted again after it breaks. The Sherman was that weapon, a symbol of practicality defeating arrogance, of the many overcoming the few. Even today, its legacy endures. In every soldier who adapts under pressure, every engineer who values reliability over extravagance, every nation that wins through cooperation rather than pride. When German officers laughed at the American toy, they could not see what history would make clear: that progress is rarely elegant, and victory is rarely perfect. The Sherman's story is not one of superiority, but of sufficiency, of men and machines that did enough, endured enough, and kept moving when the world demanded they stop. And perhaps that is the truest mark of power. Not how brilliantly something is built, but how long it can carry the weight of those who believe in it. Because in the end, amid the ruins of Europe, it wasn't the finest tank that rolled through the mud, it was the one that kept going. The laughter had ended. The lesson had begun,